Hello, everyone. Welcome to Feedstuffs 365. I'm Sarah Muirhead. Here with us today is Dr. Al Kertz, and our topic is the passive immunity related to calf mortality, morbidity, and performance. Before we get started, if you're joining us here today, we appreciate you being with us, and we want to encourage you to post any questions you might have there in the chat feature on your screen. If you're joining us from social media, simply post your questions directly in those channels. Dr. Kurt, so nice to meet you again today.
Good to be back.
So why don't you go ahead and take it away here?
All right. Well, as I think most on this call realize that measuring total serum protein is kind of a indicator of how much passive transfer of colostrum antibodies into the bloodstream of a calf occurred when colostrum was fed, depending on how early and how much and how well and so on. So that's commonly done as an indicator of that on dairy farms because it's fairly simple to measure as opposed to measuring the globulins, immunoglobulins themselves. So about I don't know 4 or 5 years ago, a coalition got together. It was led by Jason Lombard of the USDA system and got about 20 people together to review this area of total serum protein and what are the appropriate standards or levels for whether it's good quality transfer or not. And so they came up with a proposal that from um, point, let's see, 4 categories. So poor is less than 5.1 grams per deciliter. Fair was 5.1 to 5.7. Good was 5.8 to 6.1, and excellent, anything equal to or greater than 6.2. So then more recently, a study was done at Michigan State in which they used a single large herd in what is called a retrospective cohort study. That means they went back and looked at the records from that dairy to help them sort through what relationships might exist. This herd had about 3,500 lactating cows, and I've been on it a couple times. It's a well managed, high genetics herd. And at birth, the calves were weighed and given in some different treatments that you can see on the write up. They received at least 3 liters of greater than 22% Brix fresh or thawed colostrum by an esophageal tube, and then 30 minutes within 30 minutes after birth. So that's good. And then until 7 days age, they were housed individually in stalls inside a barn and fed 3 liters of a 28 protein, 20 fat milk replacer, 15% solids. That was fed 3 times a day. Some of it, most of it was bucket fed, some of it was through an automatic feeder. So they were getting about 9 liters a day. So that's a pretty high level of feeding of milk replacer. And then in both systems, whether they were bucket fed or automatic, they used a step down approach that began gradually and then decreased the amount offered until about 7 weeks of age for weaning. And actually, some of them went out as far as 10 weeks of age, depending on their consumption rates. And then they were weighed again. So that's unusual for dairies to have that much data, body weight data, but this one did. And then water was available and the starter. And so they had that always available. So that was not a limiting factor. After weanings, then they were moved together in freestall pens, grouped according to age and so on. The heifers then went through an insemination process when they were about 12 months of age, weighed about 800 pounds. So all these data were collected, and they did it during a period of time so that all these heifer calves that they're monitoring would have gone through their first lactation in the herd. And then they also had some blood samples that they took periodically, and the herd veterinarian was involved with the taking of the samples and the measuring of the blood values. They did a weekly random sample of calves 12 to 20 from 2 months old to 7 days old. So that's a good point that large dairies, where they have so many animals, they don't have to measure every animal. They can do some randomly sampling the periods of time, which reduces the extra work required for sampling. All right. So then let's see, where were we? Okay, they grouped the calves in these four categories that I started out talking about. The fair, the poor, the good, and the excellent. And then they ended up with 4,480 samples from calves in this database. So if we look at figure 1, we see a nice demonstration of the spread. Went from 3.6 to 8.8 grams per deciliter. And if you notice that above the graph, it shows how many fell into each category. So only 5.6% of the calves were in a poor category, or the poorest category. And then in fair category, you had about 21%. In the kind of the medium category, you had about a third of all the calves. And then it had nearly 40% at the high or the good category. So 40% and another 33, 34%, nearly 75% of the calves in this database had really good levels of serum total protein. And then about 25% were below that, only 5 in that lower category. So that tells you how good the administration of colostrum was and the quality of the colostrum. Now, some other data were that the calves averaged about, if we go to the next slide, they averaged about almost 89 pounds. So that's a fairly large heifer calf, because of course there'd be some twins in there, but there were only 1.45% twins. Most of the calves were bucket fed, 90%. And then the prevalence of bovine respiratory disease in the set was about 18%. Median age of about 30 days. The prevalence and median age of diarrhea and other diseases were about 38% at about 9 days, and then almost 50%, 9 days respectively for those two categories. So there was a higher prevalence of diarrhea and pre-weaning diseases than there was of respiratory. Pre-weaning mortality was only 1.36%, which is very low, because in most cases in the US now, you're still in the 6% or so, based on the most recent National Animal Health Monitoring Survey. A total of a little over 9% of the calves experienced both diarrhea and bovine respiratory disease. The morbidity in this herd was greater than reported in the last national survey, which I just referred to. That was a 2018 kind of a sub-survey of the national survey, where there was 9.5% with BRD, 17.2% diarrhea, and 33.8% morbidity. So that's kind of a little difficult to understand why those incidents would have been much greater in this herd than the national survey showed. But the pre-weaning mortality, of course, was much lower than we've seen in these national surveys. So now if we look at the data in Table 1, this is a calculation, this hazard ratio. You can refer to the original Journal of Dairy Science article if you want to know more how that works. But when that number is above 1, there's a greater incidence present. So if we look at the incidence of diarrhea, 1,706 calves had diarrhea. The hazard ratio for the excellent quality colostrum, or the excellent level of serum total protein, was very low. That was the reference. And then when they had good, they had a higher ratio of diarrhea because that's above 1. When they had the fair serum total protein, it went up to 1.3. And then with the poor serum total protein, it went up to almost 1.5. So you have a considerable increase in diarrhea depending on how much serum total protein there was, which goes back to the colostrum administration. The respiratory disease, not nearly as many, 790. But again, you see that when it was good, for some reason, it was a little lower than 1, a little better than excellent. And then when fair, 1.17, and then poor, 1.39. So we see the same thing when the poorer the total serum protein, the more likely they would have had this disease. Any disease in general, about 2,000 instances of that. Similar thing, good is 1.07, and it goes up to 1.21 and 1.5. And then if you look at the mortality, the same thing. The lowest mortality is with the calves that had the best serum total protein, and then it increased to 1.05, 1.5, and then dropped down to 1.29, or went up rather to 4.29. So that was a big jump in mortality when they had very poor serum total protein. So that's not surprising. But then, of course, they followed the calves through the heifer period and on into lactation. So if we look at table 2, we see that disease events, 0.3 for the excellent total serum protein, 0.34, 0.35, then 0.55. So not much difference in the first 3 categories. So excellent and good and even fair, they're certainly better off than when they have the poor transfer of total serum protein. Daily gains 1.7, 174, 172, 172. So not much difference there. The number of inseminations a little higher in the good and the fair, and then the poor, then the excellent quality, and then the first lactation. That's 305-day mature equivalent pounds of milk. So you see that the heifers, first calf heifers, that had excellent quality of transfer of any antibodies into the blood, had 33,200 pounds. When they had good, it was a little bit higher, 34,200. And then fair, 35,200. And then it drops down to 33.5. So really, when you have those numbers, if you look at the p-value, that's only 0.2, and that's most likely because there's a fair amount of variation in those numbers. So even though they may be numerically different, they were not significant statistically. So then the authors also noted that there were some limitations with this study. The herd was large and well managed. So results only apply to this particular herd. And when you have a large, well-managed herd, then you're least likely to have problems. So even though there was a higher incidence of respiratory and diarrhea in this herd, they had a very low mortality. So it appears that maybe the incidence was higher of these diseases, but the impact was not. So that's partly related to this being a large, well-managed herd. Health scoring may not have been specific enough to some calves, so they might have been misclassified. And then this was an observational study, so it doesn't tell you anything about cause and effect. But when we look at the bottom line, certainly this well-managed herd had really no particular problems. So if you went into a herd that wasn't as well managed, then you might see these numbers line up more dramatically than they did in this herd. And then it also indicates the importance of having good colostrum management, because remember, they selected the high quality colostrum and they had 3 liters within 30 minutes, and they tubed them to be sure that they got it. And then they were also feeding a high level of milk replacer. And so the calves got off to a really good start. So that tells us that in a large, well managed herd, you're least likely to see the problems be greater than they would be in other herds.
Still kind of a lot of variables there, I would say, right? I mean, when
Oh,
you're
yeah,
talking about
yeah.
herd size, management, just all of those types of things, but still important takeaways here. So,
Right.
uh,
And the thing about we always have to keep in mind when you're dealing with calves, there's always a lot of variation. So you need large numbers to try to pull out differences. But even then, those differences may not be that um, meaningful, even if they're statistically significant, because you have large numbers. So
mm.
when you deal with calves, you always have a lot of issues.
A reminder to those of you that are joining us here today, if you have any questions, post those there in the chat for Dr. Kurtz. Also, if you haven't seen it already, we have posted a link to his column, which covers this topic. So you can click on that now. You also can find it on feedstuffs.com and in the February digital edition of Feedstuffs, which deploys this week. So Al, let's kind of summarize here as we like to do. What is the bottom line in all of this? What do we want folks to take away from this?
The bottom line is do a really good job with the colostrum. This herd did. They only used a high quality colostrum and they tubed them to make sure that they got the quantity in. They did it within 30 minutes of birth, and then they had follow up there and a really good program. So if you get the calves off to a really good start, that puts them in good stead all the way through the growing period and into the first lactation and later lactation. So there's an old saying about calves never really get over a good or bad start. So make sure they get a good start.
That's probably very true. I think it's true about us as well, right? As we
Right.
come into the world there.
Right.
All right. Well, I want to thank you so much for your time today, Dr. Kurtz, and for sharing your insight with us. We always appreciate it. To thank all of you for joining us as well. A reminder that you can watch this interview and others on Feedstuffs 365. Just go to feedstuffs.com and you can find us there. Until next time for Feedstuffs, I'm Sarah Muirhead.